Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your local, well, I suppose I am local to wherever you are watching this, but your weekly catch-up of ancient warfare matters to distract you from the real world. What I do, of course, is I attempt to answer someone's question sent in to me by a comment, an email, a postcard, however you like. Of course, we can get questions from anybody, but you can be a patron of the podcast. Go to patreon.com/ancient warfare podcast, and you can back us at one of three levels. You can either be a legionary, a optio, or a centurion, and you can ask a question whether you're a Patreon or not. Now, today's question is from Jason Elgini. Elgini, I'm not sure. Jason Elgini, I'll say it that way. Hi, recently discovered your podcast and I'm loving it. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. I hope you don't mind if I ask a question. Not at all. A lot of old action war movies set in ancient times have two champions or the two kings from both sides meeting in combat as their armies watch on before the battle starts. Have there ever been any historical battles where two men have fought like this, or is it purely fiction? If it is fiction, are there any good stories of two champions or kings meeting in battle? All right. Well, it's not fiction, so I don't have to sort of explore fictional accounts of exactly that sort of scenario. Look, there's several battles of champions and battles where champions are selected to fight instead of the entire army. Obviously, the Battle of Champions, and you've got several others where individuals or a very small group is chosen to fight on the army's behalf. Of course, in most cases, the armies don't abide by the decision of the champions' battles. And of course, we do have, and in fact, one of the upcoming issues of the magazine will be looking at single combat. So there is indeed single combat that's caused in ancient warfare by an individual warrior, generally of a barbarian culture, challenging a Roman to fight or a Greek to fight. And there are single combats. One of the peculiar things, of course, about ancient warfare is that, generally speaking, ancient warfare is about formations of men fighting in massed combat, and yet, more often than not, surviving literary sources tend to zoom in to focus on an individual's conduct in that battle, whether it be the battles of Alexander the Great or later. So there's the individual exploit within a larger narrative of combat being massed combat. If you look at the Battle of Marathon, there's a series of little vignettes of individual conduct rather than massed conduct, which in a way is understandable because, we broke their left, they retreated, is one way of looking at battles, but it doesn't really give you anything human to sort of latch on to, even though when you don't have that kind of an account, it can be very dissatisfying to find out what Joe did. Or what would be the ancient Greek equivalent of Joe. Anyway, and so when you look at high-profile individuals, there are some consuls who fight combat. But I think the one I want to focus on to say that there are indeed occasions where kings did so is Pyrrhus of Epirus. And Pyrrhus of Epirus is one of those fascinating figures that we should know more about. He's regarded as the most like Alexander of all of the successors and all of the Hellenistic kings that come after Alexander the Great. There's Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Pyrrhus of Epirus as the great generals. So the interesting thing about that is that when he comes to the throne, he's kicked out. Then he gets his throne back through the help of the Ptolemy and his friend Demetrius Poliorcetes. They end up being rivals and enemies after he's gained the throne the second time. And of course, there's all the machinations of politics that's going on in Greece at the time. And so what you find is that, in fact, the kingdom of Macedon is incredibly weak at the time. And both Demetrius and Pyrrhus are called in to help, which ends up them being rivals. And so what happens is Demetrius sends an army to invade Epirus. Pyrrhus sends an army led by himself to invade Macedon. The two armies miss one another, so they obviously take alternate marching routes so that they actually don't come across each other on the march. And Demetrius is in Epirus, and he leaves one of his generals, a man named Pantaucus, I think is Pantaucus, maybe Pantaucus. Let's say Pantaucus rather than Pantaucus. Pantaucus is left with a large force, nothing more in the detail that we're told there, in Macedonia, and Pyrrhus invades. And so what we find, therefore, is that Pyrrhus encounters Pantaucus and they fight a battle. What Plutarch tells us is there was a sharp and terrible conflict between the soldiers and especially between the two leaders. Pantaucus was confessedly the best of the generals Demetrius had for bravery, dexterity, and vigor of body, and had both courage and a lofty spirit. He challenges Pyrrhus to hand-to-hand combat, and Pyrrhus, who yielded to none of the kings in daring and prowess, and wished that the glory of Achilles should belong to him by right of valour rather than of blood alone. Of course, he was related to Achilles according to the ancient lineages, advanced through the foremost fighters to confront Pantaucus. Now, the interesting thing here, of course, is that the idea in ancient Greek and Roman warfare of emulating Homer, and of course, again, Homer's battles are generally all about the hand-to-hand combats of individual warriors, man on man, so one-on-one combats, and sometimes 1-on-3, 2-on-3, 2-on-5, 1-on-5. So the idea that you're emulating that is something that they all sort of aspire to, which raises issues in terms of literary modeling and artistic modeling with as to whether they actually occurred or whether we're being told they occurred, but they're actually a literary, I'm like Achilles, I'm like, Hector, I'm like one of the other great Trojan hero warriors. Anyway, it's also interesting, of course, that Pyrrhus, we get in the Battle of Heraclea in 280 BC, the idea that he's a cavalry commander like Alexander, but that when he needs to bring his phalanx up, he commands it from behind. So he's not in the phalanx as such. He's commanding the phalanx, but he's with it, which is an interesting note to make. And of course, the point that Plutarch records is that he advances through the foremost fighters. So he comes through the ranks of the phalanx. So again, you can envisage them encouraging him on to do this combat, this one-on-one combat outside the battle. And it's fascinating what happens next, of course, is that first they hurl their spears at one another, then they come to close quarters and they fight with swords, which is basically like every hand-to-hand combat you've ever seen in a movie or elsewhere. Pyrrhus got one wound, but gave Pantaucus two, one in the thigh and one along the neck. Put him to flight and overthrew him, did not kill him, however, for his friends hauled him away. Then the Epirites, exalted by the victory of their king and admiring his valor, overwhelmed and cut to pieces the phalanx of the Macedonians, pursued them as they fled, slew many of them, and took over 5,000 of them captive. So, fascinating thing there is that the outcome of the battle is not decided by this combat. It's not that we'll fight and whoever wins, they win the battle. And obviously when Pantaucus is killed, that demoralizes the Macedonians, and the victory of Pyrrhus encourages the Epirites, who go on and defeat the Macedonian combat. So, look, it reads very much like it actually happened, rather than it being a invented combat just to fill the sort of legends of Pyrrhus. It's also interesting that what Plutarch says next is that this defeat doesn't make the Macedonians hate Pyrrhus, even though he's not a Macedonian, but rather be, admiring of him because of his bravery, personal bravery and battlefield bravery. And essentially what Plutarch says is they likened his swiftness and all his motions to those of the great Alexander, and thought they saw him in the shadows, as it were, imitations of that leader's impetuosity and might in conflicts, which is very interesting. And of course, one of the great legacies of Alexander was the impetuosity of his charges, and almost the Macedonian and Hellenistic commanders need to be that impetuous to be like Alexander, which is, of course, a great disaster for many of them who were not Alexanders, so they were not as good, or lead themselves to disaster Or like Perseus at the Battle of Pydna in 168, doesn't charge when he could have, which could have won the battle for him and saved the Hellenistic kingdoms from Rome, but he doesn't because he's not Alexander. Anyway, there you go. That is, of course, my attempt to add an answer for you, Jason. Thank you for your question. We look forward to getting another question from someone for me to attempt to answer sometime soon. And of course, you can also listen to the big podcast, either the Ancient Warfare podcast or now the Ancient History podcast. You'll find them all on your favorite streaming platform. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks. Bye.